Hi everyone, my name is Cornelia Sommer, and today I'm going to be playing and giving some tips for the Michigan Bassoon All-State Etudes for 2025-2026. I play with the Detroit Symphony as well as teach bassoon at Oakland University, and I also teach private students, middle schoolers and high schoolers in the Detroit area. So if you're interested in learning more about Oakland or taking lessons with me privately, you can use the contact link below. Here's how it's going to work. I'm going to start by playing the middle school etude and then giving some tips for that. Then I'll play the high school etude and give some tips for that. So if you'd like to jump to any part of this, there are timestamps in the description below. Enjoy. Okay, now I will give some tips for this middle school etude. We are going to discuss fingerings, intonation or pitch, and seeing the bigger picture of the music. Let's start with fingerings. First, there are some notes in this etude that require a technique called flicking. I'm linking a video in the description below that explains what flicking is and how to practice it. And that's all I'll say because the other video is fantastic. Make sure that you are flicking the notes that you need to flick in this etude, whether they are tongued or slurred. Next, I want to address two notes in this etude that come up a lot that you should be doing these fingerings for. The first is your middle E flat. That note. The fingering for that note is in your left hand. Your left thumb is on the whisper key. That's the bottom key there. You're going to use your first finger and your third finger. The pinky here is optional. Some people use it, some people don't. Your right hand, you're going to put your middle finger covering that hole, and your thumb is going to be depressing the B flat key, which is the top thumb key. And again, that E flat is going to sound like this. The other note that I want to make sure you're doing the right fingering for is the G right above that E flat. This is your half hole G. The fingering for G is whisper key, Your first finger now is going to cover only half of the hole. It's a half hole. Then your second and third finger cover the holes. And then this is super important. Your left pinky must push down this top pinky key here. That's called your resonance key. And then in your right hand, we have 1, 2, 3. And so your G is going to sound like this. Okay, let's move on to pitch. So the difficult thing about pitch in this etude is that it covers a really wide range of the bassoon, and that requires us to adjust our embouchure, which is just our mouth shape, for these different registers to make sure that we're in tune. I want to take the beginning of this as an example. We start on a low E flat. That's a pretty low note on the bassoon. And whenever we see low notes on the bassoon, drop your jaw. You can practice this by closing your lips and then through your cheek, stick a finger like this. And you want to be able to put your finger all the way in between your back molars. So again, we're closing our lips, but our finger is pushing through our cheek in between our back molars. Like that. Should feel like, you know, opening your mouth for a yawn. Should feel very open inside your mouth. Now to play a low E flat, we need both our hands, so we can't do this while we're playing, but test it before you start, and then try to keep that while you play the low E flat. That embouchure with your jaw super dropped, that is going to make sure that your low E flat is not too sharp. Again, the difficult thing of this etude is that we also have the other end of the spectrum. We have some pretty high notes. For example, in measure 4, we go from a low G, again, that's a pretty low note, our jaw's going to be pretty open, up to our flick B flat, this note. When we go up into this flick register, it's super important to keep the corners of your mouth in, like you have just tasted something very sour, or you're sucking through a straw. You're puckering your lips like this. So look at the difference in my embouchure. If I don't think about keeping my corners in, very hard to control the pitch, and also it's likely to be flat. But if I keep my corners in, the pitch is much better, and it's also much more stable. So practice slowly this transition between low register and high register. So practice the entire etude in chunks that slowly, and it'll really help if you look in a mirror so that you can verify that your jaw is actually low enough for the low notes and your corners are actually in for the high notes. All right, last thing to address here is seeing the bigger picture. On the technical side, there are a lot of notes in this etude, and if we're focused on each individual note, that's really overwhelming. We're likely to miss notes if we do that. Instead, we want to find patterns so that we're focusing on fewer things. For example, in the first 4 bars, there's about 20 notes. That's a lot. That's overwhelming to me. What's not overwhelming is that those first 4 measures represent just one harmony. It's an E flat major harmony, and it's the notes E flat, G, and B flat. And that's it. All I have to think about during the first 4 measures in terms of what notes am I playing are, it's an E flat major harmony. Just those 3 notes. I'm not going to get into any more of the music theory aspect of it, but as long as you're finding those patterns of notes, throughout this etude, you will be able to focus on fewer things while you're playing, and you can turn your attention to music making. That's the other aspect of seeing the big picture here. Weissenborn doesn't give us very much to go off of for musicality in this. We have a mezzo forte marked at the beginning, we have a tempo marking of Andante, and we have a retard at the end. That's it. So we want to focus on making that as beautiful as we possibly can. I like to follow a rule for phrasing called up is up and down is down. What that means is that as the notes get higher, our dynamic gets louder, and vice versa. As the notes get lower, the dynamic gets softer. Here's the difference. If I don't follow the up is up, down is down rule, the first four measures are going to sound like this. That is technically correct. There's really nothing wrong with it in terms of the technique. But if you really want to stand out as a great musician, we can make it more beautiful than that. We can make it more horizontal by following this up is up, down is down rule. Listen to the difference. That sounds more natural, more horizontal, and less robotic. So, I hope that you have enjoyed this video. I hope you've learned something. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments below. You can contact me. My contact information is also in the description below. And good luck at your audition. Now I'll give some tips for the high school etude. We're going to talk about breathing, articulation, and dynamics. Let's start with breathing. There is a long section at the beginning of the second half of this etude where there's really no opportunity to take a breath. The good news is it's totally possible to play. Luckily, the bassoon is an instrument that just doesn't take very much air. So first thing to make sure of is in that rest right before the second half starts, you write a note to yourself to take a big breath. I write BB for big breath. The challenging part is that when we breathe naturally, it's easy to expel air at the beginning of the exhale. At the end of the exhale, it gets harder. So try that with me. Just take a nice sigh. And notice at the beginning of your sigh, the breath is coming out really nice and strong, but by the time you get to the end, it's slower and weaker. Wouldn't be enough to play the bassoon. So to help sustain the airstream at the end of your breath, we're going to need to use our core muscles. So watch my hand as I take a breath in. You should be able to see it expand. When I'm looking down at my hand, it's very obvious that my hand is moving out. So first of all, get that inhale so that your stomach expands. On the exhale, you're going to use your abdominal muscles, your obliques, maybe even your lower back muscles to keep your stomach in that out position as you exhale. And the goal here is that your exhale is very even. You're not having really fast air at the beginning and slow air at the end. It's the same speed and intensity of air, and it's supported by your core muscles. So without the bassoon, that looks like this. If you keep your hand there, you will notice that your stomach eventually does sort of contract back to how it was. But if you use your abdominal muscles to keep it out, your airstream will be a lot more steady. Next, let's talk about articulation, because this etude really shows off different types of articulation that are possible on the bassoon. First of all, we have some staccato notes, as in the first measure. The difficult thing about playing staccato on the bassoon is avoiding the notes cracking at the beginning. And that's especially difficult once we get into this half hole and flick register. So if you look at measure 2, that's really what we're talking about here. The F sharp and G sharp, which are half hole notes, so your first finger of your left hand is only covering half the hole. Those are liable to crack for 2 main reasons. One is if your half hole is a little too big, particularly on the G sharp, and the other is if you're accidentally half holing your middle finger on your left hand. So if you just play around with those notes and see what causes them to crack, it'll actually be easier to avoid the cracking. So your practicing might sound something like this. I'm just going to use the G sharp as an example here. That's what we want, but let's try to make it crack. So I'm experimenting first with my half hole size. Too little half hole or too much half hole creates some cracking. And then remember, this finger can also be a culprit. So if you get that high overtone, the problem is probably your middle finger not covering the hole. Now, how can we make it sound better would be really focusing on your finger placement. And seeing if you can successfully avoid cracking, just repeating that note in a staccato fashion. The other thing I notice is if I use too much tongue, if my tongue is really slamming into the reed at the beginning of every note, that is going to be more likely to crack. Or if my tongue is too high in my mouth. I want to think of having an open inner oral cavity for these half hole notes. Now let's address the rest of the notes in the measure, the A, the B, the C, and the D. All those notes require me to flick these thumb keys. I'm linking below a great introduction to flicking, another YouTube video. So if you don't know what flicking is, I would recommend watching that first. If you do know what flicking is, make sure you're doing it on these flicked notes, because that is what will save you from cracking. So again, how to practice this? Just take it really slowly. I'm going to do just that second measure. And every single one of those notes is either a half hole note or a flick note, and we know how to fix the cracking on those now. The other articulation that we have a lot of is long slurred lines, and we want to make that a real contrast. The way to do that is going to be making sure that we're pushing the airstream continuously through the whole slur. Just like I was talking about with the long breath, Same thing applies here. We have to artificially speed up the air towards the end of these slurs to make sure that it's still continuous. An example passage here's near the end. This is 3 lines from the end in the middle of the line. We want that as smooth as possible, and the way to achieve that is through your airstream and your abdominal support. By the way, support will also help with avoiding cracking on the articulated notes, so just do it all the time. Finally, we are going to talk about the dynamics. So there's a few dynamics written on the page. For example, we have this piano at the very beginning, and at the end of this first half, we have a forte written. We need a big contrast between those. But for most of the middle of this etude, Weissenborn isn't giving us much in terms of what dynamics we should do. It is your job as the performer to come up with a dynamic scheme. You want it to make musical sense. It shouldn't sound random. And you probably are not going to want to switch dynamics very quickly. But experiment. Come up with a plan. If you're not sure what's going to work, just try a few different things. And I'll just give one example. This is in line 3. We have what's called a sequence, where we have several measures in a row of repeated musical material that's just shifted, in this case, down a little bit in each measure. A sequence is a great opportunity to throw in a dynamic plan. And the one that I chose to do, which you can hear in my performance of it, and which I'll demonstrate again now, is just a gradual crescendo over that sequence. So I'll start at the beginning of that sequence and show that dynamic growth. Simple, but that wasn't on the page. That was something that I had to come up with. You're welcome to copy my idea there, but that's not the only right way to do it. So experiment, find a dynamic plan that you like for all the parts of this where the composer does not indicate any dynamics. Thanks so much for watching this video. And again, if you have any questions about this, you can feel free to comment. If you're interested in lessons, you can contact me. The link is in the description below, and good luck with your audition.